Viona Osa Eliant was born the legal heir of the Marquise and always found herself at the center of events wherever she went. And also, at the peak of her success, she took everything for granted, as if the whole world lay at her feet. However, that picture was just a mirage that was created by her dreams. She was just another stupid woman who got everything wrong. She often wondered why she had sought love, why she had complained about something that could never even belong to her. She had everything, but for some reason, she craved even more. And this thirst was what destroyed the girl. It led her down the wrong path. All Vione had to do was just get rid of her ill-wishers, and then she would be able to achieve everything she wanted. In fact, this girl was a completely different lady who simply reincarnated into her body. For the first time, as soon as she opened her eyes, she looked around and did not understand what was happening. For her, everything looked incredibly familiar, of course, but at the same time, everything was foreign. This room was exactly like in her memories. She was able to remember everything down to the last detail, and therefore immediately recognized it. Then the girl went to the mirror and looked at her reflection. She realized that this face was very familiar to her. She was now Viona, but in fact the girl was Ligia, and simply reincarnated into her body for some incomprehensible reason. The girl was the reincarnation of a dead Viona, and she also dreamed of changing her boring life. And for this reason, everything happened. The girl didn't know for sure which option was correct, because in her assumptions, she could have been a young Viona who simply saw her future. She understood that perhaps it was even just a dream, and everything that happened next was completely unimportant. However, one thing was clear to her. She was a woman who had died, cursing the entire world, and she was also a woman who had lived an ordinary life in her past incarnation. And now she somehow became the Viona, who stood in front of the mirror again. Of course, because of this, she had a strange feeling inside. In her new third body, she stored memories of two lives at once, and this was something unusual for her. At that moment, the maid entered the room, and as soon as she saw Miss, she immediately became very scared, and also asked her for forgiveness. The girl was shaking all over with fear, and said that she didn't know that she had already woken up, because if she had known, she would have definitely been ready. But immediately bowing, she told Viona that she had to immediately prepare water for washing. And after that, she left the room. As soon as the girl heard all this, she was shocked because the girl ran away without even letting her say a word. She assumed that she was scared, but it was strange. However, then she realized that she was in the body of a Viona, and she had a very difficult character, so she should not have been surprised that the maid reacted in such a way. Soon they brought her warm water to wash, as well as a carefully selected dress and jewelry. However, all this had to be ready before she woke up. Before, the slightest mistake would drive the girl crazy for the whole day. But when she opened her eyes for the third time in another body, Viola was more patient. As soon as the maid brought her water, she bowed again and asked her for forgiveness. The girl immediately asked her to state her name. As soon as the maid heard this, she became frightened and looked at her in surprise. But Viola, getting to her feet, said that she asked her name and wanted to hear the answer. Seeing the expression on the maid's face, the girl understood perfectly well that she had not expected such a question at all, and it had caught her off guard. From her rough hands and skin, it was clear that the maid was only a low-ranking servant, but she did not understand why the girl was being courted not by a maid, but by a simple girl. Then the girl with a trembling voice said that her name was Marie, and Viona immediately asked why she was there. Without even giving her time to answer, Viola said that she was the only legitimate daughter of the Marquise's house, and that there was definitely no place for someone like her in her chambers, so she wanted to know what the girl was doing there anyway. Marie immediately fell to her knees and said that she had done wrong, and also asked for mercy and forgiveness from the lady. At that moment, the girl thought that she was very lucky, because yesterday's her would definitely not have listened to these excuses. Viona turned to her, and when she heard something about the nanny, she asked if it was really she who sent her. The maid looked at her with tears in her eyes and immediately said that it was really so. Then she asked why this was done, and the maid answered in a trembling voice that she really didn't know. Viona sat and looked at her for a while, but after that she allowed the maid to leave, and even her face turned red. Marie could hardly even breathe, And as soon as she did not move from her place, the lady asked if she really intended to serve her in such a form and condition. As soon as she heard her own words, Viola realized that it sounded as if she was rejecting her because of her low status, but that was absolutely not the case. So after some thought, she advised the maid to just drink some water and calm her hiccups and nerves a little. The girl looked at her and said that she looked as if she was about to faint. Viona also advised her to lean forward and drink water from the opposite side of the cup. Then the hiccups should immediately go away. Maria was very surprised by this, but she did not move from her place, but continued to sit there and hiccup. The girl then sighed heavily and could not believe that she had to explain such obvious things. All of this irritated her to no end. However, in a rather rude voice, she turned to the girl and told her to go out and call another maid in her place. Marie immediately stood up and ran out of the room. She was really scared from this meeting and didn't even know what she needed to do next. Viona, meanwhile, thought about how this girl was such an idiot, and she also wondered what she from the previous body would do to her. After some time, there was a knock on her door, and several maids came in. They said that they had to help Miss get ready. Viola was still thinking about what had happened. She knew that the nanny knew her character very well, but she did not understand why she had sent such an inexperienced girl. She even thought that perhaps the matter was so urgent that she didn't even notice that Marie was a simple servant, and for that reason sent her away. As soon as the maids helped the girl change her clothes, Viola immediately asked where the nanny was. One of the maids immediately bowed and said that she was in the mistress's room, and as soon as the girl heard this, she was surprised, because usually she rarely went to the Marquise openly, and without saying another word to them, the girl simply headed for the exit. Of course, the maids immediately became worried and began asking her where she was going, but the girl was not going to answer. Of course, old Viona would have taken out all her anger on these servants, because the nanny was the only one who took care of her, and she certainly could not have done that to her. And her former egoism did not allow her to tolerate the thought that the nanny had left the Marquise above her. But the girl did not understand why all this now seemed to her only a childish farce. Some time passed from that moment, and as soon as the girl began to approach the door where the Marquise was supposed to be, she saw many other maids standing there. At that moment, her theory was immediately confirmed, but she was not stopped by such a large number of guards, so she immediately approached the doors. In an angry voice, Viona told them to open the door for her immediately, since the maids had blocked her with their bodies. The girls told Miss in trembling voices that it was not the best time for visitors, and therefore they did not want to give in to her. However, the girl knew very well in advance what a miserable future awaited her, so she had to change her fate correctly and rationally. Of course, it would never have occurred to her before, but now she suddenly realized that she needed to see the Marquise immediately in order to change this future. Since the maid didn't listen to her nicely, she simply took them aside with her foot and opened the doors to the office. As soon as the people who were inside heard the doors open, they immediately looked in that direction to understand who dared to disturb them. Viola, meanwhile, began to approach them closer, and as soon as she saw all the people, she immediately realized that this was true information, and they were all right there. As soon as the man with dark hair saw this girl, he immediately turned around and started to leave, saying that it was time for him to go. The woman with dark red hair immediately became furious and began to shout loudly at him and told him not to dare do this. She tried to break free from the hands of the nanny, who was holding her with all her might, but she failed, and eventually the guy just left. Viola, who at that moment was standing not far from the door and watching everything that was happening, was surprised that he did not even turn around at the girl's screams. Well, now that she looked more closely, she realized that the Marquise was terribly similar to Viona in her last moments, dying full of hatred for the world. This girl was the only daughter of a wealthy count's family, and at the age of 18, she married the Marquis of Elion, and thus acquired the title of Marquise. For years, she chased him trying to win his love, and it became such a big story that it was discussed for many years by all of high society. This girl spared nothing, neither money nor connections, just to win at least a grain of his attention. But the Marquis, in turn, was colder than an iceberg. He not only kept his distance from her, he even avoided lightly touching the girl as if she could poison him with one finger. Nobody really understood why he married her at all. There were even rumors that it was only because of her solid devotion. And over the years, her melancholy only grew stronger. In her despair, she even tried to give birth to an heir, straining her already fragile health. But in the end, even a daughter, even a biological one, had no value if she could not inherit the title. So the woman became angry with her and truly hated her with all her soul. As soon as she saw Viona, she immediately started throwing herself at her and screaming that it was she who was to blame for everything. She also said that if the girl had been born a boy, everything would have been different, and that was the reason why she blamed her. Well, Viola at that moment understood perfectly well that even if she had been born a boy, it still would not have changed anything. The Marquise did not pay attention to her because she was a girl. He simply did not care about both women, and for this reason he ignored them. Viola also understood that there was no point in explaining anything to this woman. She was too lost in her delusions and would simply not listen to her. The woman continued to clutch her head and said that it was all because of her daughter, that she was to blame for everything and did not want to listen to any other arguments. She even wished death on Vion, talking about how she would disappear from her sight and finally die because she no longer had enough patience. Meanwhile, the nanny tried with all her might to calm Milady down and said that she needed to do this because she had said too much unnecessary things. However, the woman was so emotional that she even hit the nanny in the stomach. She couldn't do anything about it and let go of her hands, and as soon as the Marquise was free, she immediately dropped everything and ran to meet her daughter. Her eyes were wild. She was really ready to kill her. Viona was shocked, but she managed to dodge the woman's hand in time and did not expect that it could actually try to kill her. But in reality, she was not going to tolerate all this. So while the girl was preparing for the next blow, she simply turned around and began to run out of the room with all her might. As soon as Viona ran outside, she immediately closed the doors behind her. She decided that she definitely couldn't handle the crazy one-on-one, so she needed to take other measures. A knight immediately approached her and asked if the door needed to be locked. But the girl looked at him with a very angry look and told him not to stand idle, but to grab this woman as quickly as possible, who was really mad. She pointed to the sword that was on his belt and told him to hook it by the handle so that the woman would not escape since the lock was not working. The man immediately understood what she meant, and as soon as he took out his sword, he put it in the door handles as if the Marquise had not tried to open them. But she could not. Of course, everyone was amazed by her behavior, and so for some time they stood in silence and simply watched as the doors moved back and forth. Soon, Vion heard strange sounds and immediately realized that she even began to scratch the door with her nails. No matter how hard she tried, the girl still couldn't remember Mark ever getting so crazy that she even thought about whether it was really all because of her husband, who didn't pay attention to her. Viola decided that she didn't need to worry about it anymore, so she simply smiled and wished the servants good luck and was about to leave. The girl headed back to her bedroom, and some of the maids ran after her to escort her. In fact, in her entire life, Viona had never seen the Marquis even once enter his wife's room. He even presented a knight to his door so that she would not be able to break into his chambers or office without permission. Then suddenly, Viola, after some reflection, stopped and thought about how she could have been born at all if these two were so far from each other. She had the face of the Marquis, but she did not inherit a single feature from her father. The girl looked through all her relatives, and no one had the golden brown hair that she had. Viona thought it was really strange, and was already wondering if she was his daughter at all, or if her mother had done things differently. But she believed that the Marquise was downright obsessed with this man, and was madly in love, so she would hardly be able to cheat on him. So Viona, continuing to stand in place, thought about the fact that perhaps she could just ask her so-called father directly. He could tell her the whole truth. The girl immediately went to his office, even though the maid shouted after her that she shouldn't even go there. Viona thought that it made no difference whether she was his daughter or not. She had already screwed up once, so she had nothing to lose. When she approached her father's office, one of the knights who stood guard immediately asked what brought her there. The girl replied that she had come to the Marquis, but then realized that he was her father and corrected herself, and also asked if he was there. The knight immediately said yes, but she was not allowed to enter. But the girl did not listen to the last word and said that they should go their separate ways. After which she abruptly opened the door into the office. As soon as Viona entered inside, she immediately saw her so-called father, who was sitting at his desk and writing some papers, and his butler, who was pouring him fresh tea. As soon as the butler saw her, he immediately became wary and asked why she suddenly decided to come so unexpectedly. However, when Viona looked at the Marquise, she noticed that he didn't even bat an eyelid. He was cold, as always, which didn't surprise her at all. She didn't even understand what the Marquise could possibly find in this cold-blooded and inattentive man. The butler immediately approached the girl and asked if she would like some tea, but Viona replied that it was not worth it, and she herself approached the desk where her father was sitting. She decided to come straight to him and asked in a rude voice if she really was his daughter. The man responded to this question quite calmly, looking up from the paper and asking why she was even asking such questions. But Viola was also calm and said that directly to what she asked, she wanted to know the truth. The man looked the girl straight in the eye and asked if it really mattered, but she told him the truth and said that it really didn't. Then he returned to his papers again and suggested not to waste his time on such trifles, since it was not mortally important for her. But Viona replied that for her personally, it was not that important, but if she was going to get to the top, such little things could become a big problem. As soon as the man heard this, he simply looked at her silently for a while. And after that, he asked in surprise whether she had now decided to target the Empress. The servants who stood behind and heard all these conversations were also incredibly surprised to hear this. Viola, as soon as she heard their sobbing, immediately thought that she should have closed the door from the very beginning, so that no one could eavesdrop on them. But it was too late, so she simply asked the man if she answered yes to this question, it would change anything. The Marchioness was getting on his nerves, and he said she was wasting her time on nonsense. He asked her to speed up and just give clear, concise answers. The girl immediately responded that rumors of blood relationship were a dagger that could be thrust into her back at any moment, and this, of course, did not play to her advantage. She knew this firsthand, because when she became Empress, these rumors hung over her like a guillotine. The Marquis never refuted them. His silence, of course, restrained the Volkovs. Well, in high society, she was still torn to pieces, as if slashed by invisible blades. And the girl always found herself in the center of attention, but this was not at all in a positive way. So she realized that at that moment, she needed to know the real truth more than ever. Viona said that she was not so stupid as to jump into the fire with a bundle of brushwood in her hands. So the girl asked him to tell her if she really was the legitimate daughter of the Elliot house. The Marquis was silent for a while, and then, turning away from his daughter in a rough voice, he said that this question was not even worth his answer, so he was not going to give it to her. Meanwhile, the butler immediately began to close the doors, since he was already beginning to be irritated by these sobs and groans from the guard and the maid. However, Viona was quite satisfied with this answer, because now everything became clear to her. The Marquis was not silent at all. At least in this matter, he was always honest with her. This man never doubted for a moment that she was his daughter. He simply had no need to prove anything to her or to the whole world. He was always a man of few words and restrained, and Viola, like everyone else, invented doubts herself and interpreted everything as she wanted. Therefore, the girl concluded that all this time she was tormented by an illusion born of her own inferiority complex. And it was this that simply took and ruined her whole life. The Marquis said that if she was going to continue to talk nonsense, it would be better for her to leave, because he still had a lot of things that he needed to resolve. However, Vione had enough of this whole conversation because she understood everything without a shadow of a doubt. She was his daughter, so the girl smiled happily. As soon as the man saw the smile on her face, he immediately became indignant. But at first he was surprised and looked at her with an angry look, not understanding why she behaved like that. And as soon as the girl noticed this, she immediately felt very awkward because she thought that she had laughed too loudly and thus done something wrong. However, now she knew for sure that he also had feelings, so she decided that he had the right to know the answer to the question he asked. Viona asked if it was true that he wanted to know if she was going to become empress. However, in return, she only asked if he really thought that there was even one unmarried woman in the empire who did not dream of this title with all her soul. Of course, she also slandered the crown and dreamed of standing next to him with pride in her chest. Viona sincerely believed that she should get the throne, and then they could live happily like in a fairy tale. But even knowing in advance about her unhappy future, she did not know whether she still wanted to achieve this goal. She didn't know whether she should be submissive and follow her fate, as if everything had already been decided in advance. The girl wanted to know what she wanted in the end. As soon as the man heard her answer, he immediately asked if she really lived the same life as other unmarried ladies. Of course, Fiona was so sure that she wanted power with all her soul, but the throne was not a toy that could be obtained simply by desire. It was a path like a web, which was woven from the blood of lies and 1,000 threads of other people's interests that she had to take into account. And in other words, even if the girl refused, there was no way she could have avoided it. So she just asked her father if her wish had ever started anything at all. For some time he was silent, but when he wanted to speak, the door to the room opened and thereby interrupted him. Viola immediately turned around to see who it was. She even thought that the Marquise's wife had been following her all this time and was already seriously determined to fight her off again. However, her assumptions turned out to be untrue. It was another butler who burst into the office completely unceremoniously, which greatly surprised not only the Marquise, but also the girl. She decided that he had simply lost his temper, or that something so urgent had happened that he didn't even have time for basic politeness. Viona's father immediately asked the man what was going on, and the guy asked for forgiveness for such an unexpected and unceremonious visit. Bringing his breathing back to normal, he said that something had happened to the lady, and as soon as the Marquis heard this, he immediately became wary and scared. And Viola, at the same time, finally remembered what had happened. It was not the first time she had seen the butler in such a state. And this could mean only one situation. In fact, on that day of her past life, everything was exactly the same as on this one. When Viona woke up, her nanny was not around, and upon hearing that she was urgently called to the Marquise, the girl, of course, was very furious. After that, she hit the maid, stuttered, and tried to explain the situation. The girl's anger did not subside. She threw absolutely everything that came to her hand, and the poor maid tried to dodge. And no one even dared to stop her. Only later, after a long time, the butler came, just as confused as he was now. His movements were always calm, only then they became abrupt and very hasty, and he, just as now, could not utter even a single word. That's why Viona was even very surprised, not understanding how she could have forgotten about this at all, since she already knew what exactly this person was going to say. And her assumption was justified, because the butler shouted that the lady had died. Several hours passed since then, and all the fuss finally calmed down. The funeral took place, when Vienna looked up and noticed that the weather was too good for such grief. According to tradition, the Marquise's body was to be cremated and placed in the family's crypt. The ceremony was supposed to take place after everyone had left the burial site. Only the closest relatives could attend, which is why only the Marquise and her daughter came there. And soon quite a lot of people from her family and relatives came until the body was transferred to the fire, so that they could say goodbye to it and release all the sorrows. At that moment at the funeral, many people were talking among themselves, because people could not understand how the Marquise could have died so unexpectedly and quickly. They even decided that since they had come to the funeral, they would soon be told the cause of the Marquise's death, so the people decided to simply patiently wait for new announcements. But since the Marquise did not tell them anything right away, they understood that it was not an illness at all, because they would have been informed in advance. In any case, many people were curious not only about the cause of death, but also how they prepared such a beautiful woman for the funeral ceremony. They were really eager to see the dead lady they had known all their lives, just to see if she was still as beautiful as she had been. Viona, hearing all this, did not understand how they could even say such things, and assumed that the funeral was like a spectacle for them. She even wondered how many of those present were truly grieving for this woman. But at that moment, she suddenly looked at the Duke, who looked really serious and sad. Viola realized that he was terrified. People began to talk among themselves and thought that very soon the coffin would be opened. They were interested in looking at her dead and lifeless body. However, the man took the flower that she loved so much and simply placed it on top of the coffin lid without saying anything or lifting the lid. People immediately began to whisper among themselves. They could not understand whether they really had not intended to lift the lid rudely. After all, they had violated the funeral tradition. It was the same as depriving the Marquise of her last honors. There was no prayer, no farewell speech, so they assumed that the man was truly heartless, because he simply put the flower on the lid of the coffin and turned around and started to leave. Then people were convinced that the rumors were indeed true. As expected, the Marquise turned out to be a completely cold-blooded person. Viona. This also did not surprise her at all, because she thought so. But just as these people did not understand his behavior, she was once mistaken in exactly the same way as they were about him. In fact, last time the girl didn't know anything and couldn't stand his coldness. Whispers behind his back and looks full of pity simply irritated her to the depths of her soul. In a rage, she ran out of the funeral hall. The Marquise did not even try to stop her. She even understood the fact that if she had done the same in the current situation, he would have behaved absolutely the same. However, Viona now understood his motives. She had no desire to make any scenes. She knew the fact that the Marquise had simply committed suicide. And while the maids were distracted, she threw herself out of the window of her room. The room was on the third floor. If it had been an ordinary third floor, like in the world she lived in last time, then everything would have even ended with minor bruises. However, in the poetry of the Marquis, the ceilings were incredibly high, and for this reason, there was no shortage of sacrifices. At almost all funerals, the body was put on display for farewell, with the exception of those where death was caused by a contagious disease or the body was so disfigured that it was impossible to even look at it with the eye. But even in this case, people were of course warned about this in advance. But in this empire, suicide was a real taboo. Such people were not accompanied on their final journey. No prayers were offered for their repose. Such people were simply condemned and scolded for it until the end. The Marquise had placed a ban on disclosure, so of course no one was supposed to know the true cause of death, and even Viona didn't know about it until the nanny accidentally let it slip. From that moment on, the official records had to say that she died from illness, even if it was a lie. Therefore, Viona realized that she, like the Marquise, had to simply show due respect to her mother. The girl took the yellow flower and placed it on the coffin as her father had done. Even though the Marquise was not pure in the eyes of other people, even though she had never been a worthy mother even for the girl, she still did it despite the fact that it hurt her pride. At that moment, the Marquis turned his head because some man approached them, and as soon as Viola herself looked at him, she did not immediately understand who this man was. He was quite an old man, but in fact he was a magnate, Count Pisson, and he looked quite sad. It was immediately obvious that he knew the deceased and was grieving. When Viola looked more closely, she immediately realized that this man was her maternal grandfather. Since he was the father of the Marquise, of course he had to be present at the funeral. In fact, she had even completely forgotten about this detail. Then the man came closer to the coffin and with a trembling hand placed another flower on the lid. However, he did not move away as quickly as the previous ones did. He held his hand on the coffin for some time and simply looked as if into nowhere. She understood perfectly well how hard it was for him to let go of the daughter he had raised and cherished himself. It was worth looking at him, and Viona's heart immediately sank, because she understood perfectly well what pain he felt when he lost her. After some time, the man began to get up, but suddenly he felt dizzy, and he could not keep his balance and began to fall. The girl immediately noticed that he could hit himself at any moment. She already wanted to run to help him, but she didn't have time. And all because at that moment, a young guy ran up to him and grabbed the Count. The man immediately looked at him and asked if everything was okay with him because he was very worried. Viola then breathed a sigh of relief because someone had managed to catch him, but she also realized the fact that there was no way she could help him because this person was many times bigger than water. But when she looked at the guy who was standing next to the Count, she wondered who it was. She realized that this young man was very dear to the Count because he was very friendly to him, and at that moment the boy turned around and looked straight at Viona. However, this look made the girl very wary. She did not understand why he looked at her with such hostility, because all this time she could not remember who he was at all. But she supposed that perhaps she imagined it. However, when he turned again and glanced at her with the same hostility, she realized that this was not so. Of course, Viona had no intention of showing any weakness, so she looked back at him with the same stubborn gaze. However, at that moment, the guy simply turned around and began to lead the Count in the other direction. Of course, this outraged her, because she thought that he would now come up and say something. However, he simply took and ignored. She couldn't believe that such a trifle could upset her. She even felt a little awkward, because all her facial expressions were very active, and it was noticeable that she was very angry. However, Viola did not understand why his face seemed so familiar to her, because she could not clearly remember. The funeral of the Marquis ended up lasting 3 days. On the last day in the crematorium, where only the closest relatives were lowered, it was finally time to commit her body to the flames. Viola stood next to her father and watched as her mother burned to ashes. She had once longed for love from this man. She pretended to be obedient and even tried to adopt habits that were typical of boys just to please her mother. But in the end, such actions only made the girl even more angry. Her mother was only interested in the Marquis's attention, and if Viona had been even a little bit like him, the girl thought that she would have treated her at least a little bit better. However, she also understood that even if she had asked her about this, she would definitely not have been able to hear an answer from this woman, because she was dead. And now, since her father was a widower, of course they would have started persistently trying to match him with new brides. After all, his only child was only a daughter, who was not able to inherit the title, and this meant that it was necessary to move on. However, then she suddenly remembered that in her past life, until her death, the Marquise never married again. Viola even thought about the fact that this meant that the Marquise was much closer to him than she thought. Of course, she would like to believe all this. However, she would never know the exact truth. Of course, it was possible that she wanted to console herself with the thought that the one she loved did not hate her, but she still could not know for sure. When the woman was finally completely burned, she was transferred to a small vase, and the Marquise immediately handed it to his daughter, telling her to take it. As soon as Viona took it in her hands, he used a small knife to cut off several centimeters of his dark black hair. After this, he reached out to his daughter and said that, as she herself knew, this was the last rite. After that, he put both their hair strands inside this pot and said that such a ritual was that a strand of hair of the closest blood relative had to be put in the ashes, and that is what they did. The girl said that she knew all this very well, because it was a symbol of the fact that the connection was not broken even after death. The man said that everything was exactly like that. Then she thought that, for the tradition to be complete, the hair of the Count Pission, that is, the father of the Marquise, was also needed. However, Violana understood that the man was too shocked after what happened and would definitely not want to cooperate. At the moment when they were about to leave the chapel, a lady with brown hair suddenly rushed to meet them. Smiling, she came closer to them and said that apparently she was not late after all. The girl also said that since she was not part of the immediate family, she was not allowed to enter, and for this reason, she waited outside the entire time. After this, the stranger added that they couldn't even imagine how she was worried that she might not even make it in time. Viola then remembered that she had almost forgotten this person since she had only seen her a few times. It was the Countess of Pension. She was Count A's second wife, which meant that she was technically her maternal grandmother. But of course, Viona never considered the woman to be one. When she turned her gaze to this young lady, she realized that this was the first time she had ever seen the Countess so close. And all this is because last time she ran away from the funeral on the very first day, so she had no opportunity to cross paths with this lady in any way. And besides, she was from a common class, and there was no blood connection between them, so of course there were no reasons for communication. At that moment, the Countess suddenly began to take out something and said that she wanted to give it to them. In a small bag, there was a cut-off piece of hair. She handed it to the Marquis and said that she was afraid he would be upset, so she asked him about it herself because she did not want them to be subjected to such tactlessness, and she could. The Marquis immediately took and poured the hair that was in that bag straight into the pot where his wife's ashes were also. He immediately bowed to the Countess and said that he didn't even know how he could thank her, because it was really very important. But the woman replied that she had only done what she had to, after which the man, without saying a single word, turned around and began to leave. Viola, of course, followed him. But then suddenly, the Countess turned to the young lady and with a smile on her face asked if she would like to visit him. She explained that her grandfather really wanted to see her and get to know her. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised, because she did not expect that he could really want to see her. This was surprising to her, since the Count practically never visited the capital, and after the Marquise fell ill, he did not appear at all. So she asked the Countess why he suddenly wanted to see her. The woman was a little surprised to hear this, and immediately said with a smile on her face that it was because the girl was his only blood relative, and it was quite natural that he would like to see her. Viola immediately thought that last time, soon after the death of the Marquis, the Count also died, without experiencing such a shock. For him, it was too big a blow. Despite the fact that the girls got part of the inheritance, the main fortune went to the Countess, his wife, and it was so huge that people even began to whisper that she killed the Count for this money. Fiona's nanny kept telling her day after day that she too should accuse the Countess, and soon she became so fed up with it that without really thinking it through, she too easily gave evidence against this woman. And for this reason, the Countess had a miscarriage right during the interrogation. It was really terrible. The loss of the child was entirely Fiona's fault, and she was aware of this fact. But the girl smiled and asked if it was true that she was no longer the only blood relative. As soon as the Countess heard this, she was immediately surprised, but then immediately frowned and looked at the girl with great suspicion. Viola assumed that she took it as an insult. Of course, she would have liked the woman to just accept everything as it was, because it was not like her. But she sincerely hoped that the child in her womb would survive, because she did not deserve to experience such grief again. The last of the long silence of the decanter, in a trembling voice, said that she was wrong, because she was still his only blood. Then Viola suddenly pointed her finger at her stomach and asked if this meant that the child that was there was not from the Count Pisson. The woman immediately became angry. She started yelling at the young lady and said that she was crossing all the permissible boundaries. Viola was surprised. She remembered that the Count was supposed to die in 2 months, and the Countess was supposed to lose her child during the investigation. This meant that she didn't yet know that she was even pregnant. She immediately turned to the woman and said that she should calm down, because excessive worry could harm her child. The Countess continued to be outraged by this whole situation. She shouted at the girl, but only in turn said that whether to believe her or not was her decision alone. Viona only said that if she wanted to keep this child, then she needed to take good care of herself, and also tell the Count about it, if of course it was his child. The Countess continued to be irritated by all this. She squeezed her hand into the trigger and told the girl that he was not a count, but her grandfather on her mother's side. As soon as Viona heard this, she was very surprised. She could not believe that this was even worse than if she had doubted her origin. She didn't understand why the girl was angry because of how she called the Count, because for her it didn't matter at all. Viola immediately answered the Countess that how she should address people was her personal business, so she advised the girl not to interfere in these matters anymore, since she simply had no right to vote there. Then the woman asked in a trembling voice, and interrupting her sentences, why she always spoke about the Marquis. The Marquise was her mother, after all, and she had to call her that, but the girl went to the carriage and said that from that moment on, family for her were just strangers, so she did not consider it necessary to call them anything else. When she died for the first time as a Viona, her mother and father were everything to her. She lived only for their attention and praise. However, having lived her life as a Ligia and having experienced true parental love, she simply realized that blood kinship did not mean soul kinship at all. Viola decided to end the whole conversation there, and approaching the carriage, said that it was already late, so she had to go. But the Countess did not stop. She began to scream and told the girl that this was her mother's father. Did she really not want to see him at all? The girl didn't even respond to this, She simply got into the carriage and drove away with her father back to the estate, leaving the Countess behind. When Viola returned to the estate, she was immediately met by the maids, and her nanny was in a very bad state. The woman lay on the floor and cried very loudly. She was very sorry that even the lady was very cold, and did not understand how such a little girl could cope with such great grief. However, Fiona thought about something. You see, she managed well during her life with the Marquise. I didn't play out a drama as if the end of the world had come, so for the girl this behavior was completely incomprehensible. She was very tired, and did not understand what they were thinking about, putting on such a show in front of her right after the funeral, and in front of a relatively young child at that. So Viola turned to the nanny in a stern voice and told her to wash away her tears, because in such a state she herself could end up getting sick. And after that, she went to her bedroom. She said that a woman needs to be strong, because if she loses heart, no one will be able to support the young lady. Viola thought that this was beyond all reasonable limits, and that was the reason why she made such a remark. The nanny at that moment began to wipe away her tears and said that she really had to take all her emotions into her hands and put them away because she had to take care of the poor girl who had lost her mother. As soon as she said these words, she began to cry again, and Viola thought that if someone had passed by, they would have thought that a corpse was being mourned in this place, but she did not shed even a single tear. The girl felt how much she wanted to sleep and was glad that she could finally rest. Quite quickly, Viona fell asleep, but just as quickly woke up because she heard some noise coming from the door. It was the Countess who asked the nanny to move out of her way because she needed to meet, but the woman would not let her in and said that the girl did not want to see her. But the woman said that if this was really true, then she would like to hear it from the girl personally. The nanny then even began to threaten her with guards, because if she continued in that spirit, then she would have to take action. The Countess immediately thought that since they wanted a quarrel, she could arrange it and said in a rude voice that, by the way, she was her maternal grandmother and had every right to see her. The nanny immediately started yelling at her, asking how she dared to manipulate something like that. But before she could say anything else, Viona's voice was heard. The girl approached them and asked what was going on there. As soon as her employees heard this voice, she immediately looked at her and felt a little ashamed that they woke her up. The nanny immediately began to cover the girl with her hand and said that nothing significant had happened, that she should go back and have a good rest because she had been through so much. But Viola, of course, did not listen to her. She stepped forward and, looking the Countess straight in the eyes, said that they had encountered each other quite often that day. She also said with a smile on her face that the woman should not stand on the threshold all this time, but should go inside. The nanny immediately began to be indignant. She said that this person was completely unacceptable. But Viola, hearing about this, immediately looked at her in surprise and asked how all this was supposed to be understood. Then the woman realized that she had gone a little too far and asked the lady for forgiveness. In fact, Viona had been on the imperial throne for 8 long years, and in order to maintain her dignity, she learned to humble those who contradicted her. The girl also understood that for the nanny, this side of her was probably new, which is why the woman was so shocked when Viona spoke in such a way. But the girl had no intention of obeying her and said in a grave voice that if the woman did not calm down immediately, then it would be best for her to simply leave and not interfere. The nanny could not believe that she had actually done this to her, but Viona turned to the other maids who were standing nearby and told them to take this woman away. The nanny continued to resist, and the maid did not listen to the mistress and stood in place. They were confused, did not know what to do and how to act correctly. But the girl, looking sternly at her, asked, did they really want her to throw them out by force? This became a good motivation for the maids, so they grabbed the nanny and started to take her out of the room, and she kept screaming and asking the mistress how she could do such a thing. But Viona only turned to the Countess, and smiling, told her not to stand still, but to come over and sit down. Soon they went into the living room, and the maids brought tea for them. The girls sat opposite each other and were silent for a while. Viona spoke first and asked why she was silent, since she definitely didn't come to her without a reason. The Countess sighed heavily and said that the girl turned out to be completely different from what everyone had said about her. But the lady turned to her and said that this was probably not what she wanted to share with her either. Then the countess immediately asked if it was really her nanny. She wondered what the young lady would do if she accused her of insulting the nobility. Viola immediately realized that the girl was very serious and was not going to back down, although she had foreseen this. The girl immediately said that she didn't like to beat around the bush, and therefore asked her to state directly what she wanted. Then the countess said that she would very much like the girl to see him, and she certainly did not intend to back down from this request. Viona sighed heavily and thought that this was unexpected, because she could not even think that this woman could use her own nanny against her. But the countess resorted to such methods. Now it was difficult to refuse her, so the very next day, together with the countess, she went to the estate where her grandfather was. The woman said that at that time he was living in the guest wing, lost consciousness during the funeral ceremony, and woke up only recently. Before opening the door, the countess smiled happily and told the girl that the first thing he asked about when he woke up was her. Viona! This was not at all impressive, so she did not answer anything. When they went inside, she saw her grandfather lying in bed, and he smiled happily at the sight of them. As soon as he saw his granddaughter, he extended his trembling hand forward and asked her to come closer. As soon as Viola saw him in this state, she was finally convinced that the countess had not killed this man. There was no hint of a thirst for life in his eyes, which is why he died calmly without anyone's help. As soon as the grandfather took his granddaughter by the hand, he immediately asked with hope in his voice if everything was okay with her, as much as was possible in their situation. But Vion did not understand why she should be out of order, since they had never been close with the Marquise. All she did was hate this woman all the time, but now she certainly couldn't feel sorry for the woman who had repeated her fate. Viola, like her, destroyed herself for the sake of love. That was all the similarity that was to her, as well as a speck of condescension. They were both blinded, so Viona did not understand and did not find an answer to her question. What was so special about this love that she lost her mind and did stupid things? However, now she did not know whether she would have been able to avoid these same mistakes at all, and this frightened the girl quite a lot, because she did not want her fate to repeat itself. She really didn't want that. Having met the man for whom she had lost her head in love, she would again turn down a completely wrong path and simply bury her life with her own hands. At that moment, to her great surprise, the grandfather suddenly took it and hugged his granddaughter tightly and asked her for forgiveness. Tears were streaming down his eyes, and he said that no matter how much it hurt, he shouldn't have turned away. It was all his fault. He spoke about how he had to bear the burden of being the culprit himself, and asked that Viola not cry under any circumstances. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised, because she didn't even know that she was crying. But he, wiping away her tears, told her not to cry so bitterly. Even if it was silent, it was still visible. Some time passed from that moment. They spent quite a few hours together, and soon grandfather had to say goodbye to his granddaughter because he had to leave for a short time. The man, after saying goodbye to her, said that she should remember that he never left her. She was not alone and could always ask for help, so I shouldn't worry. He explained that his departure was only a temporary measure, and all this was only for her sake, after which, together with the countess, he got into the carriage and left. When several days had passed since that moment, a nanny came to Viona, whom she forgave again, and communicated with her normally. The woman, smiling happily, asked the lady what dress she would like to choose. At that moment, Viola already had serious doubts about whether she had let her go in vain, but she realized that it was better this way than her constant hysterics because of that graphics. However, this restless nanny simply exhausted her, but she had to endure all this because it was she who raised her, and she certainly could not completely ignore this woman because it would be completely ignorant. Then suddenly, the nanny noticed that Viona was distracted and told the lady to get ready, because the visit to the imperial palace required much more preparation than she even thought. She said that other ladies were only invited to the palace after their coming-of-age ceremony, but she was given such an honor even at the young age she was. So the nanny said that she was truly exceptional, but all those dresses that she had for special occasions were really bad taste. She also felt very sorry that they had practically no time, because if they had, she would have ordered many more new ones in order to impress everyone at that event. Soon the nanny took out a soft blue dress and said that of all of them, this was the most dignified. The girl looked at him carefully and began to evaluate the looks as the nanny asked what she was thinking. The woman also said that, as expected, sky blue suited her very well, and she asked Viona to try it on because she was absolutely sure that it would look perfect. However, the girl just looked at it for a while and thought that it was such a pure shade, as if it were even the sky itself. Suddenly, very unpleasant memories began to pop into her head, so she threw the dress aside and said that she did not want to wear it. Hearing this, the woman was genuinely surprised and asked how it was possible that she had always adored this color with all her heart. But now she suddenly refused it so abruptly. Viola started yelling at her and said that she now found him disgusting, so she asked the nanny to find her another outfit, but definitely not in the same color. The woman was shocked, but she did not argue with the girl any further, and, heading back to the wardrobe, said that of course she would have found some other option that would have suited her just as well. In fact, it really did happen that the color that was once incredibly beloved by her eventually became the most hated by Viona. She even brought it all up herself after she burst into tears in front of the count. It became much more difficult for her to control her emotions, and this irritated her. If she was already thinking about their meeting at that moment and came to a similar state, then she was even afraid to imagine what would happen when she saw the person she was supposed to meet. She kept thinking about whether she could fall in love with this man again so recklessly that she would not be able to resist this feeling and would do all sorts of stupid things that would only worsen her situation. Vion was also curious whether he would still be as dazzlingly beautiful as he was that time, since she had fallen in love with him only at first sight. The nanny suddenly noticed that the lady looked very strange, and besides, such a sharp change in emotions alarmed her. So she asked the girl if she really felt unwell. The girl looked at her for a while, but soon she put aside the invitation that had come to her and immediately said that everything was fine. The nanny picked out a new olive-colored dress for her and said that in them there was not much time for hair and makeup, so she advised the girl to try on the dress as soon as possible. And when some time had passed since that moment, and the woman had completely helped her get ready, Viona looked simply amazing. When the nanny looked at the final result, she said that she looked amazing and that there was definitely no one in the empire more beautiful than her. And that was true. When the girl looked in the mirror, she didn't even smile. Once upon a time, she also considered herself the most beautiful in the whole world. But since then, everything has changed. It wasn't that she was ugly, but she certainly wasn't the best in the empire. There were many people better than her, so she thought that saying something like that would be definitely wrong. Viona also knew the one who was truly called the Imperial Rose, with bright, pure sky blue hair. This girl was a beautiful and beloved pearl of the empire, and she was the one who was worthy of having such a status. The official reason for the invitation to the imperial palace was the emperor's condolences on the death of the Marquise Viona's mother, and it was for this reason that she received this invitation. However, those who knew a little more understood that the reason was actually not this at all. The emperor had only one empress, as well as two favorites and countless concubines, and there were more than 10 children from them. He had 6 sons in total. Of all these principals, only 2 were the main contenders for the throne. The first prince is the son of the first imperial mistress, and the 6th prince is the son of the late former empress, who was born more than 10 years ago. The 6th was declared the heir at birth in the same year. He was even left without a mother. The new empress was chosen from an impoverished baronial family, but she was never able to create a new power structure. For this reason, all the nobility supported the first prince, the son of the eldest favorite. He was 16 years older than the heir, which put the latter at a distinct disadvantage. However, the emperor placed his bets on the younger heir he had chosen, and the first step in his entire game was the Viona itself. The Marquise Eliant, who had remained neutral for generations, was a welcome ally for both the nobility and the emperor. But neither the nobility nor the emperor himself could influence her. And it was for this reason that the emperor switched to Leonov's visit to the palace. It was not just a formality. The girl knew perfectly well that the emperor needed a pretext to bring her to that place, and the death of the Marquis became simply the perfect cover for this. No one could fail to understand the hint when the imperial carriage was sent for her, the one that was only allowed to be used by members of the imperial family or those whom the emperor personally approved. So Viola somehow got back into the wheel of her fate, which she certainly didn't like at all, because she tried with all her might to get out of it. The whole time she was traveling to the imperial palace, she was thinking about what would happen if she saw again the man whom she had loved with all her soul last time. Yes, of course, she was afraid of the meeting with him, and of how she herself could change when she saw him. The all-consuming love that the leader felt for him was truly destructive, and the girl did not know if she would be able to cope with it at all this time. While they were traveling to the imperial palace, her father suddenly approached the girl and asked if she, like the others, was planning to become an empress. When Vione heard his voice, of course she was very scared because she did not expect that he would want to talk to her. In her first life, when she first came to the palace, he did not say a single word to her. So now, when he started the conversation first, it surprised her very much. So the girl only asked if he really thought that her wish could mean anything at all. The count sighed heavily and immediately replied that he certainly would not have asked this if he had not known, but Viona continued to insist on her own and asked why her opinion had suddenly become important to him. She explained her fears by the fact that he had never done anything like this, but the man immediately said that it was all because this matter concerned her directly, so he wanted to know how she felt about it. Viola, hearing this, was amazed. She did not understand what was happening to him and where such a sudden change came from. She decided that it seemed to her then, but for some reason, last time, he did not ask her about anything. Even when she became the crown princess and then the empress, he never asked her about such things. And besides, he was never at all interested in what exactly she wanted and felt. So Viona looked at her father with caution in her voice and asked, "What if she didn't want to?" To complete the picture, the man asked if this meant that she did not want to be empress. Viona wondered if she had said that she didn't want to. Would it have been possible to stop everything then? Viona realized that the emperor had most likely already decided that she was the one who should inherit the title, and if nothing extraordinary happened, then she would inevitably receive this status. He chose her not out of love, but because of the influence that stood behind the girl's name. It didn't matter what Leona wanted at all. The emperor simply didn't have a more suitable match for his crown prince, and he couldn't refuse such a profitable alliance, so he was going to get it with all his might. Viona asked if she said she didn't want to become empress, would he be able to make it so she could avoid it? Her father was silent for a while. After that, he said that, of course, it would be quite difficult. Of course, Viona was not surprised at all, and she asked why in that case he asked her anything at all. The man did not answer this. He looked out the window and saw a rather beautiful estate that was visible from there. He only said that they had already arrived and suggested discussing this topic a little later. As soon as Vion heard that they were already near the palace, she was amazed because it happened much faster than she thought, and the girl did not even have time to mentally prepare. However, the carriage stopped. Father got out first and offered his hand so that she would not fall while she was going down. And then suddenly, the man returned to their conversation in the carriage and said that, although it was indeed very difficult, it was not at all impossible. Vioni was very surprised to hear this. She could not understand what this meant at all. For some time the girl doubted and could not believe that he really said something like that. She assumed that perhaps it meant that he could grant her wish, or perhaps there was some hidden meaning in the sentence that she didn't immediately understand. She couldn't figure out at all what this man had in mind, but she decided to figure it out a little later, since now she had slightly more important things to do. As soon as they entered, they were immediately let in to the emperor, and he was also informed that the Marquis and his daughter had arrived. When Fiona began to go inside, she thought about the fact that she had arrived there again. These walls of the imperial palace and the throne room where destinies were decided were painfully familiar to her. Very soon, she would see him again for the first time in that life, and this, of course, made the girl incredibly nervous because she did not know what to expect. Viola and her father immediately introduced themselves and bowed to greet His Highness the Emperor, saying that it was a great honor for them to be there. However, the man who was sitting in the middle of the throne room on his luxurious chair immediately laughed, and continuing to smile, he said that this was exactly what one should expect from the daughter of the great chancellor. She was absolutely all like her father. They even did this greeting synchronously. As soon as Viona heard this laughter, she immediately began to try to remember the same thing last time. He laughed. The girl remembered that, at that time, he only smiled slightly, watching her awkward greeting. But now he laughed truly sincerely, and this made her worry even more. The emperor turned to the Marquis and asked why he had hidden such a beautiful pearl from everyone all this time, since it was simply magnificent. The man responded to this only with formalities and said that it was a great honor for him. Then suddenly, the emperor turned to Viona and told her to come closer. The girl glanced at her father. He immediately nodded his head in agreement, meaning that she had to do it. Then, with slow and measured steps, she approached the emperor, and he immediately, with a smile on his face, asked how old she was. Viola immediately stated her age, and as soon as the man heard this, he laughed loudly again and said that it was just perfect. Of course, the girl was not surprised, because she knew that the conditions of her proposals were incredibly important to the emperor. But she did not understand one thing: why he was much happier than last time, because she only greeted him and told him her age. And he reacted very violently. But at that moment, the butler entered their room and addressed His Majesty the Emperor and said that the crown prince had arrived, and as soon as Viona heard this, she immediately froze in place. Her breathing became very fast, and her heart seemed to have stopped. But the emperor said that this was very good and asked him to enter immediately. Viola didn't understand what you were doing to her, what to do. She didn't know if she would be able to look at him calmly and either fall in love again so much that she would lose herself, like last time. The girl really hoped that in this life he would mean nothing to her, and she would take this meeting calmly. And then the door to the throne rooms opened, and he walked in.